"You're not brave. Brave people don't pick on someone who can't fight back," declared Prince George to 3 drunks tormenting Guardsman Elliot Marsh at Buckingham Palace. For minutes, while dozens of tourists and even security held back, the harassment had escalated in front of the world's most famous gates. What Elliot Marsh did next shattered centuries of silence and changed his career forever. The confrontation lasted 15 seconds. The consequences lasted forever. But to understand why this moment mattered, you need to know what kind of man stands guard at Buckingham Palace and what it takes to earn that red uniform. If you're into stories like this, liking the video and subscribing would help me out a lot. Elliot Marsh carried himself with the bearing of someone who had seen more than most men twice his age. At 26, his face showed no emotion as children pointed at his towering bearskin hat, and adults whispered about whether he was real or just an elaborate decoration. But behind those steady eyes lay 3 years of combat experience in Afghanistan's Helmand province, where staying alive meant reading every face in a crowd and separating genuine threats from curious onlookers. The military had trained Marsh to be what his sergeant called a human tripwire. Every person who approached his position registered in his peripheral vision. Marsh cataloged them all without moving his head a single degree, his instructors in Helmand having drilled this awareness into him during those scorching desert patrols where the wrong assumption about an approaching stranger could mean the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. Combat had taught Marsh that danger rarely announced itself with fanfare. The most lethal moments began with something ordinary: a man walking too casually toward a checkpoint, a woman whose eyes moved differently than her companions, a vehicle that took one turn too many past the same intersection. These small details separated the trained soldier from the ceremonial figure, and Marsh had learned to trust the uncomfortable feeling that crawled up his spine when something didn't fit the pattern. The changing of the guard ceremony represented a strange theater of absolute stillness that had survived wars, revolutions, and centuries of social change. Tourists gathered to witness this ancient ritual, expecting the guards to stand like museum pieces while they took their photos and videos. What they didn't understand was that beneath the red fabric and polished brass lived soldiers who had sworn an oath to protect, regardless of whether the threat came from foreign battlefields or domestic troublemakers. As the morning crowd thickened around his position, Marsh's trained awareness began picking up subtle signals that something was shifting in the atmosphere. 3 men near the front barrier moved differently than the families and tour groups surrounding them. Their voices carried a rougher edge that cut through the general murmur of respectful observation. One wore a stained England football jersey that looked like it had been slept in. Another gripped a bottle wrapped in a brown paper bag with the possessive hold of someone who had been drinking since breakfast. The third man kept glancing at Marsh with the calculating stare of someone planning mischief. Their body language spoke of entitlement mixed with liquid courage, a combination that Marsh had learned to recognize during his service. In Afghanistan, identifying potential threats meant staying alive. Here at Buckingham Palace, the stakes felt different but no less serious. These men carried themselves like they owned the space around them, pushing closer to the barrier with each passing minute. Real Queen's guards weren't just ceremonial figures dressed in costumes for tourist entertainment. They were active-duty soldiers from elite regiments, trained in combat tactics and authorized to use force when necessary. Marsh's rifle was real and his bayonet a live weapon. The discipline required to stand motionless while enduring harassment was the same discipline that kept soldiers steady under enemy fire. Every guard understood that maintaining composure under pressure was both a mark of professionalism and a tactical advantage. But as Marsh watched the 3 men's behavior grow more aggressive, his military instincts began sending him warning signals that couldn't be ignored. The way they tested boundaries by stepping closer to the barrier. The way they looked at him not with curiosity, but with contempt. The way they seemed to be working up their courage for something more than casual observation. His experience had taught him that when multiple indicators aligned, action usually followed quickly. The crowd continued to grow around his position. but Marsh's attention remained fixed on the developing situation. His training had prepared him for combat zones and ceremonial duties. But what was about to unfold would test his ability to balance military protocol with basic human dignity. The three men were moving closer, and their intentions were becoming clearer with each step they took toward his position. What started as verbal mockery quickly transformed into something far more sinister. The ringleader in the stained England football jersey moved with the exaggerated confidence of someone who had been drinking since morning, his amateur tattoos visible as he pushed past families and elderly couples without apology. His companion gripped a bottle of cider wrapped in brown paper, while the third man positioned his phone like he was expecting something worth recording. Their aggressive entitlement immediately set them apart from the respectful tourists around them, claiming space at the front barrier with the swagger of men who believed the world owed them entertainment. The harassment began with crude taunts that showed their complete lack of respect for what they were witnessing. The man in the football jersey called Marsh a robot, his voice loud enough to carry across the courtyard as he asked whether the guard could blink or if he survived by photosynthesis like a plant. His companions laughed at each observation, encouraging him to push further with their alcohol-fueled amusement. The crowd around them grew uncomfortable as these men treated a trained soldier like a circus performer, but their discomfort remained silent. A little girl in the crowd tugged at her mother's sleeve and asked in a clear voice that carried across the uncomfortable silence, "Mommy, why are they being mean to the soldier?" Her innocent question highlighted the cruelty that adults were choosing to ignore, but her mother simply pulled her closer without answering. The child's perspective cut through the adult tendency to rationalize bad behavior or assume someone else would handle the situation. What happened next crossed the line from verbal harassment into physical aggression. The man in the football jersey pulled a crushed beer can from his pocket and threw it directly at Marsh, the metal container splashing against his pristine red trousers before clattering onto the ancient cobblestones. Gasps rippled through the crowd as people processed what they had just witnessed, and instead of stepping forward to intervene, phones immediately went up throughout the gathering. Camera lenses focused not on ceremony but on documenting evidence of what was unfolding before them. The dangerous escalation reached its peak when the man in the football jersey reached into his jacket and pulled out a plastic bottle filled with what appeared to be yellow liquid. He held it up for the crowd to see, his voice carrying across the courtyard as he declared, "Bet this will make him move." Several tourists immediately backed away in horror, recognizing that the situation had crossed from uncomfortable into genuinely dangerous territory. Parents grabbed their children and moved toward the palace gates, no longer interested in getting the perfect photograph. The crowd's reaction revealed everything about human nature when confronted with cruelty. Some people lowered their voices to nervous whispers, while others raised their phones higher to capture better footage. A few tourists started creating distance between themselves and the developing confrontation, but no one stepped forward to tell the three men to stop their harassment. The collective silence grew heavier as everyone waited for someone else to take action. Security personnel maintained their positions following established protocols, their training covering many scenarios but not addressing what to do when tourists decided to torment the guards they were supposed to be protecting. The gap between policy and human decency created a vacuum that the three men filled with increasing aggression. The bystander effect played out in real time as witnesses chose documentation over intervention, each person assuming someone with more authority would handle the situation. The atmosphere had transformed from ceremonial respect into something resembling a medieval spectacle where crowds gathered to watch someone suffer for their entertainment. The uncomfortable truth was that decent people were choosing to be spectators rather than participants in stopping obvious cruelty. No one stepped forward, and the air seemed to crackle with what might come next. The crowd's psychology revealed itself in that charged moment as hundreds of witnesses chose documentation over intervention. Each person looked around at the others, waiting for someone with more authority or courage to step forward first. The businessman in his pressed suit glanced at the retired military veteran standing nearby. The veteran looked toward the palace security personnel, The security officers followed protocols that seemed designed for different kinds of threats. This chain of assumed responsibility created a vacuum where everyone expected someone else to act, leaving no one actually taking responsibility for stopping the obvious cruelty unfolding before them. Even the security personnel maintained their distance, following protocols that seemed inadequate for the reality of the situation. Their training covered terrorist threats, crowd control during official events, and managing large groups of tourists during peak season. But the handbook apparently didn't address what to do when the situation escalated beyond their written procedures. The gap between policy and human decency created confusion among those whose job was supposed to be maintaining order and safety. The bystander effect played out in real time as responsibility scattered among hundreds of witnesses. Fear, protocol, or simple assumption that someone else would step in left hundreds frozen in place. What happened next showed how the crowd's passive response actually emboldened the three men to escalate their behavior even further. Their initial verbal taunts had received no pushback from the audience, which they interpreted as approval or at least acceptance. The lack of negative consequences for throwing the beer can convince them that they could push boundaries without facing real opposition. Each moment of silence from the crowd gave them permission to take their harassment to the next level, creating a dangerous feedback loop of escalating aggression. The uncomfortable silence that settled over the courtyard was broken only by the mechanical sounds of camera shutters and nervous whispers. Phones continued clicking as people documented the harassment instead of stopping it. The digital age had created a new kind of bystander behavior where recording evidence took priority over preventing harm. Social media had trained people to think like content creators first and good citizens second. The possibility of viral footage outweighed the immediate need to help someone in distress. Parents pulled their children closer but didn't speak up to protect the soldier being humiliated in front of those same children. Tour guides continued their scheduled explanations in hushed tones, treating the harassment like an unfortunate interruption rather than something requiring intervention. Police officers patrolling the area remained focused on their assigned routes, either unaware of the escalating situation or uncertain about when their involvement was warranted. The system designed to protect everyone seemed paralyzed by its own rules. Guardsman Marsh remained perfectly still despite the growing humiliation, bound by duty and protocol that prevented him from responding to verbal provocation. His training had been clear about his role during ceremonial duties. He was not supposed to engage unless physically contacted. He was not supposed to speak. He was not supposed to acknowledge harassment or respond to taunts. This rigid discipline, which served him well in combat zones, now worked against him as the crowd interpreted his stillness as acceptance of the abuse rather than professional restraint. The situation reached a breaking point as the man with the plastic bottle prepared to escalate from verbal abuse to physical assault. Still, no adult stepped forward to stop what everyone could see was about to happen. The collective failure of courage created a perfect storm where cruelty could flourish in broad daylight surrounded by hundreds of witnesses. The uncomfortable truth was that decent people were choosing to be spectators rather than participants in basic human decency. Into that vacuum of cowardice stepped the only person no one expected. 11-year-old Prince George, in a crisply pressed navy blazer, had been watching the entire scene unfold with growing concern. His posture remained straight, not stiff, just present, as his father had described during these test runs, designed to teach him about royal duties. This was education in action, allowing George to navigate the complexities of public life without constant parental guidance, encouraging him to develop independent judgment about what he witnessed unfolding before him. The protection officer beside George maintained professional stillness, following protocol that required silence unless directly addressed. This structured approach to George's education emphasized independent observation and processing, crucial elements in developing a future monarch's understanding of duty and responsibility. The officer's role facilitated George's comprehension of the traditions he would inherit, while allowing him to draw his own conclusions about the events before them. George's attention had focused not on the pageantry of the ceremony, but on Guardsman Elliot Marsh himself. His keen observation recognized something different about Marsh's military-grade stillness that set him apart from mere ceremonial display. This capacity to recognize and appreciate the discipline and commitment of those in service revealed a quality that would prove crucial as the morning's events continued to escalate beyond anyone's expectations. The escalating harassment created an internal struggle for George as he watched adults fail to act while a dedicated soldier suffered in silence. His face hardened with what could only be described as anger as the three men's behavior shifted from mockery to aggressive intimidation. The protection officer remained focused on protocol, following procedures that didn't account for this kind of moral crisis unfolding in broad daylight. George understood that the impossible situation facing Marsh required someone to break the cycle of passive observation that had allowed the cruelty to continue unchecked. His jaw set. He knew what had to be done. The moment when George made his decision marked a critical juncture that would challenge every assumption about age, authority, and moral courage. He stepped forward with calm determination that belied his young age, moving past the psychological barriers that had paralyzed hundreds of adults around him. His movement toward the rope barrier created a shift in the crowd's attention as people began to recognize that someone was finally taking action, though they couldn't have predicted who that someone would be. George walked behind the rope barrier, approaching the three men with a composure that stunned the crowd into complete silence. His movement was deliberate and purposeful, showing none of the hesitation or uncertainty that might be expected from someone his age confronting aggressive adults. The crowd's collective intake of breath was audible as they processed what they were witnessing. An 11-year-old prince was doing what hundreds of grown adults had failed to do, stepping directly into a dangerous situation to defend someone who couldn't defend himself. The powerful words that followed would be remembered by everyone present that morning. George's voice carried clearly across the courtyard as he stated, "You're not brave. Brave people don't pick on someone who can't fight back." The clarity and steadiness of his delivery challenged the men's behavior while highlighting the fundamental difference between true courage and cowardly bullying. His words cut through the morning air with the authority of someone who understood the meaning of genuine bravery despite his youth. His intervention demonstrated wisdom and courage that most adults in the crowd had failed to show throughout the entire escalating confrontation. The directness of his challenge shifted the focus from Guardsman Marsh's vulnerability to the three men's obvious lack of character. George's ability to identify the core issue and address it directly revealed a level of moral clarity that transcended his age and social position. He had recognized that someone's dignity was being attacked and decided that protocol mattered less than basic human decency. The 11-year-old prince had become the moral compass the situation desperately needed. His willingness to act on principle, even when it meant personal risk, demonstrated qualities of leadership that went far beyond ceremonial training or royal education. George had moved beyond passive observation to active intervention, showing that understanding duty meant taking action when others remained paralyzed by fear or indifference. But the three men weren't interested in moral lessons from a child, no matter who that child happened to be. The man in the football jersey's face turned red with fury as he processed the public humiliation. An 11-year-old had called him a coward in front of hundreds of people, and his alcohol-soaked pride couldn't handle it. He stepped toward the rope barrier with clenched fists, his movements aggressive and unpredictable as he prepared to cross into restricted space where Prince George stood waiting. George didn't back down from the escalating confrontation. Instead, he continued his moral stand with words that cut deeper than any adult intervention could have managed. He explained that the guard was trained to protect people like them, even people who didn't deserve protection, and that attacking someone who couldn't respond was exactly what cowards do when they think no one will stop them. His voice remained steady despite the physical threat approaching him, showing a composure that most grown men would struggle to maintain under similar circumstances. The protection officer recognized the critical moment when words were about to turn into physical violence. His training kicked in as he moved to position himself between Prince George and the approaching threat, but the situation was developing too quickly for standard protocols to handle effectively. The man in the football jersey had already committed to crossing the barrier, his movements showing the unpredictable aggression of someone whose judgment was compromised by alcohol and wounded pride. Guardsman Marsh watched this unfold from his ceremonial post, his military instincts screaming warnings that couldn't be ignored any longer. His training had been clear about remaining at his post unless physically contacted, but Prince George's safety trumped every regulation in the handbook. In one fluid motion that demonstrated years of physical conditioning and combat experience, Marsh vaulted the rope barrier with the speed and precision of someone whose life had depended on quick movement under pressure. What happened next showcased Marsh's military training in ways the ceremonial uniform couldn't convey. His response was swift and controlled, using exactly the amount of force needed to neutralize each threat without causing permanent damage. The first man found himself driven backward onto the ancient cobblestones. The second dropped to his knees as Marsh's strike connected with surgical precision. The third attempted to flee but was caught and controlled before he could escape or regroup. Each movement flowed with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to end confrontations quickly and decisively. The entire confrontation from Marsh's first rope crossing to the last man hitting stone took exactly 15 seconds. His movements had been economical and effective, showing the kind of tactical thinking that separated trained soldiers from amateur fighters. In those 15 seconds, spectators' cameras captured not a fight, but disciplined protection in action. The speed of his response left most observers struggling to process what they had witnessed unfolding before them. Marsh's actions protected both Prince George and the principles they both served, regardless of the career consequences that would certainly follow. His decision to abandon his post and use force against civilians represented a complete break from established protocol. But the protection of the royal family superseded every other consideration. His military training had taught him to prioritize mission success over rule following when lives were at stake. The immediate aftermath brought the sound of sirens as police and paramedics arrived to process the scene and tend to the subdued men. The crowd stood in stunned silence as they processed what they had witnessed, many still holding phones that had captured fragments of the confrontation. The man in the football jersey looked up from the cobblestones with blood on his lip and recognition in his eyes as he saw Prince George standing safely behind the barrier. The ancient courtyard fell quiet, except for the professional voices of arriving authorities. For the first time that morning, the tourists maintained respectful silence as they watched officials take control of the situation that had spiraled so far beyond normal palace protocol. The courtyard of Buckingham Palace had transformed into a crime scene as uniformed officers processed the three men who lay scattered across the ancient cobblestones. Paramedics checked each man for injuries, while police officers took statements from witnesses who had finally found their voices after remaining silent during the actual confrontation. The man in the football jersey sat with his back against the palace wall, blood trickling from his split lip as he stared at the ground with the hollow expression of someone processing consequences he hadn't anticipated. The scene unfolded with the organized efficiency that comes when professionals take control of chaos. The crowd that had been chattering and photographing throughout the harassment now stood quietly, their phones lowered, their voices reduced to whispers as they watched justice being administered with clinical precision. Parents held their children closer while elderly visitors shook their heads at what they had witnessed. The atmosphere had shifted from carnival entertainment to solemn recognition of what had actually transpired in their presence. The man in the football jersey looked up from his position against the wall and spoke words that carried across the silent courtyard. "I didn't know," he said, his voice thick with regret and dawning understanding of the gravity of his actions. His statement revealed the uncomfortable truth that his harassment had been born from ignorance rather than malice, though ignorance provided no excuse for the cruelty he had inflicted. The recognition in his eyes showed that he finally understood the difference between tormenting a tourist attraction and assaulting a trained soldier who had served his country with honor. The incident could not be treated as typical because too many people had witnessed it and too many phones had captured fragments of the confrontation. Dozens of videos from different angles would soon make their way to social media platforms, ensuring that the story would extend far beyond the palace gates. The widespread documentation guaranteed that both Marsh's actions and the three men's behavior would face public scrutiny. What had begun as private harassment had become a public reckoning with consequences that none of the participants had anticipated when the morning began. Colonel Harrison arrived within minutes of the police, his dress uniform pristine, despite the urgency of his response to reports of protocol violations by one of his guards. He approached Guardsman Marsh with the bearing of someone who had spent decades balancing military discipline with practical reality. His questions were direct and uncompromising. "You broke protocol. You left your post without orders. You used force against civilians." Each accusation hung in the air between them as Marsh stood at attention, prepared to accept whatever consequences his actions had earned. Marsh's response to each charge was simple and unwavering. "Yes, sir," he replied, his voice steady despite knowing that his career as a ceremonial guard might be ending with those two words. His acceptance of responsibility showed the same character that had driven him to act when others remained paralyzed. He had chosen duty over protocol, protection over career advancement, and he was prepared to face the consequences of that choice without complaint or excuse. What happened next defied every expectation about military justice and career consequences. The colonel's expression softened slightly as he delivered news that no one had anticipated. Marsh would be reassigned to personal protection detail at the family's request rather than facing disciplinary action. The royal family had specifically requested him based on his demonstrated judgment and courage under pressure. His protocol violation had earned him promotion rather than punishment, showing that sometimes doing the right thing receives recognition from those who matter most. Prince George approached Guardsman Marsh as the official proceedings concluded, his small frame carrying itself with dignity that matched his 11 years of royal training. The crowd watched in respectful silence as the young prince looked up at the soldier who had risked his career to protect him. The words that followed were simple but carried the weight of genuine appreciation. "Thank you," George said, his voice clear and steady. Those two words acknowledged not just Marsh's physical protection, but his willingness to stand up for principles when others chose passive observation. The incident transformed everyone who witnessed it, creating a new understanding of duty and courage that extended beyond royal protocol or military regulations. Tourists lowered their phones and offered real applause for the first time that morning, recognizing the real people behind the ceremonial uniforms. Both George and Marsh had learned that sometimes protecting what matters requires breaking the rules, a lesson that would influence their future decisions when faced with similar choices between protocol and principle. Word of what had happened would spread quickly through networks of witnesses and social media, creating ripples that would extend far beyond that single morning at the palace gates. The next day, the crowd at Buckingham Palace was different, more respectful, quieter, and somehow more aware of what they were really witnessing. The morning air carried the same crisp quality as the day before, but everything else had changed in ways that couldn't be measured by official announcements or policy updates. Tourists still gathered around the ceremonial barriers, cameras still clicked, and children still pointed at the towering bearskin hats, but their behavior showed a fundamental shift in understanding. The casual chatter had been replaced by respectful murmurs, and the aggressive jockeying for the best photo angles had given way to patient observation. Word of the previous day's events had spread through networks both digital and personal, changing the entire atmosphere around the palace grounds. Social media posts carrying fragments of video footage had reached thousands of viewers overnight, but more importantly, people who had witnessed the confrontation firsthand were sharing their experiences with friends, family, and colleagues. Parents explained to their children what they had seen, while tour guides now incorporated yesterday's events into their historical narratives about duty and service. Hotel concierge found themselves fielding thoughtful questions about royal protocol and military service, rather than simple requests for directions. The transformation became visible in small gestures that revealed deeper changes in perception. A young boy in school uniform approached the ceremonial barrier and offered a small salute to Guardsman Marsh as he passed during his patrol route. The gesture lasted only seconds, but it carried the weight of genuine respect rather than tourist entertainment. Marsh acknowledged it with a slight shift of his eyes, the minimal movement representing professional recognition between two people who understood that respect is earned through actions rather than demanded by position or protocol. Prince George watched the ceremony with a different expression that morning, his face showing new understanding of what leadership really means. His posture remained straight and attentive, but his eyes moved differently across the scene, taking in details that had previously been invisible to him. The experience of stepping forward when adults remained paralyzed had taught him that sometimes leading means acting when others choose inaction, speaking when others stay silent, and accepting responsibility when others look for excuses. His education in royal duty had taken a practical turn that no classroom could have provided. The crowd's behavior reflected this new awareness as they applauded the guards with genuine appreciation and asked more thoughtful questions about military service and royal responsibility. The sustained applause demonstrated their recognition of the values the guards represented, moving beyond surface-level pageantry to acknowledge the real people serving behind the ceremonial uniforms. Families pointed out details they had missed before, explaining to their children the significance of military bearing and the discipline required to maintain such composure under pressure. The guards themselves seemed to stand straighter and march with slightly more precision, responding to the crowd's elevated appreciation with enhanced performance. Both George and Marsh had returned from their ordeal with new wisdom about courage, duty, and standing up for others when conventional authority fails to act. Their shared experience had created an understanding that transcended age differences and social positions, showing that moral courage operates independently of rank or protocol. George had learned that leadership requires personal risk and individual action, while Marsh had discovered that protecting principles sometimes demands breaking rules. Together, they proved that courage and duty transcend age and uniform. Their actions had inspired others to see beyond the ceremony to the real people serving their country through military and royal duty. The guards were reminded that their ceremonial duties connected to something larger than routine, while the royal family had gained new appreciation for the individuals who dedicate their careers to protection and service. An 11-year-old prince and a dedicated guardsman had restored dignity to an ancient tradition through modern courage, proving that timeless values can be refreshed by contemporary actions. The incident had shown that real leadership emerges from individual responsibility rather than inherited position, and that protecting what matters requires personal commitment regardless of potential consequences. Their example had created lasting change that would influence future interactions between the public and those who serve, establishing new standards for when principles matter more than procedures. The morning that changed everything began with simple words that cut through adult indifference and cowardice. Real strength isn't about following rules blindly, but about knowing when to break them to protect what truly matters. Prince George and Guardsman Marsh both understood that sometimes doing the right thing requires abandoning protocol and accepting the consequences. Their actions that morning at Buckingham Palace proved that courage doesn't depend on age, rank, or position. Remember Prince George's challenge before you stay silent. You're not brave. Brave people don't pick on someone who can't fight back. Sometimes the most unlikely heroes teach us the most important lessons about courage and standing up for others when everyone else chooses to watch. If this story moved you, share it, so more people learn what real courage looks like.